Oh boy, I can't wait for Minister Guilbeault to tell me why it's good for government to take money out of my pocket with the carbon tax, only to give a little bit of it back at the end of the year. Let's hear what he said.
We're here to talk about the Canada carbon rebate, which is one thing you'll never hear Pierre Poilievre talk about. But the reality is that over the past few years, in fact, since 2019, 8 out of 10 Canadians, low income to middle income Canadians, get more money back than they're paying for carbon pricing. That is a reality. That is a fact. And as carbon pricing goes up, so does the carbon rebate. The
Carbon pricing is a euphemism meant to disguise the fact that it's a tax and makes us poorer.
rebate will go up April 1st, as will carbon pricing as well. Pierre Poilievre was lying last week when he said that there's no price on pollution for large polluters. That's simply not true. In fact, the price on pollution is much higher for our biggest polluters than it is for average Canadian, as it should be, and that continues to go up. And they don't get a rebate because they should be paying as large emitter, as large polluters. And the other thing you'll never hear Pierre Poilievre talk about is the impacts of climate change and how much it's impacting Canadians, how much it's costing Canadians. We're talking about our fish stocks disappearing. There's no shrimp in the Gulf of St. Lawrence this summer. We're talking about the province of Alberta having to ration water for residents, for businesses, for the agricultural sector. Climate change is real. It's impacting Canadians and it's costing Canadians, and you'll never hear Pierre Poilievre talk about that.
Talk about Montreal dumping 2 billion liters of sewage into the St. Lawrence River. So we're going to completely here dismantle Stephen Guilbeault's garbage about the carbon tax and about carbon rebates. So the way the carbon tax works is there is a set amount of tax that is applied to, obviously, carbon goods in the economy that all of us have to pay. The most explicit example is gasoline. On April 1st, the carbon tax is increasing federally to 17 cents per liter. So for every liter of gasoline that you or I buy, we are going to pay 17 cents in carbon tax. Now, that also applies to things like coal and gas and so on, natural gas and so on. Now, we pay that tax throughout the year. Obviously, the more carbon that an individual uses, the more gasoline he burns, for example, the more he's going to pay in carbon tax. We don't hear that a lot from the Liberal government. What instead we hear about is this fantastic carbon rebate. Everyone's getting a carbon rebate in Alberta, $1,800 for a family of 4. Carbon rebate, carbon rebate, carbon rebate. They make it sound like this is a policy where they can take money from us and then give more of it back. It's nonsense. It's total nonsense. Here's the problem with it. First of all, gasoline and gas in general, oil and gas, is what's called an inelastic good. That means we use pretty much the same amount of it, whether, for example, gasoline is $1 per liter or $1.25 per liter. We need it to go to school. We need it to go to work. We need it to take vacations. We need it to heat our homes, especially when it's minus 40 outside. So even if the price of gas rises, even if the price of oil rises, even if taxes increase on those goods and services, we still have to use gasoline. We still have to use oil and gas. Thus, even though Guilbeault talks about incentivizing Canadians away from carbon consumption, we can't just wean ourselves off of it immediately. No, of course not. We need it, and we need it desperately. So then he introduces his rebate. And he says, well, you pay tax every year on carbon, but you also get a rebate, and so you're actually better off. Now, again, the problem with that is that it balances out the carbon tax. At least that's what the official position of government is. I'm not convinced of that argument at all. I talked to many people. All of them are saying they pay much more in carbon tax than they get from their generous rebate from government. At any rate, that rebate, when all is said and done, supposing government's numbers are true, which again I don't, balances out how much tax an individual pays. Therefore, why would they stop using carbon? Someone might say, well, if they stop using carbon, their rebate is still the same. And so they're actually $600 or $800 richer than they would be last year. But the cost imposed on switching away from carbon, electric vehicles, solar panels, wind, et cetera, imposes a cost far higher than the supposed benefits of the rebate. Take a gasoline vehicle, for example. We can drive hundreds of kilometers, go to a gas station, fill up literally in 2 minutes, and drive hundreds of kilometers more. It's a miracle. The gasoline engine is a miracle. It's efficient, and it works well, and it's relatively cheap. Now, compared to an electric car, which travels how many miles and then has to fill up at a charging station, not for a minute, not for 2 minutes, but for much longer than that, costs are imposed through time, for example. It means that one, it's more expensive to buy an electric car right now to begin with, but also when we factor in the time that's taken into waiting at a fuel station, at a charging station, it becomes much more expensive for many individuals to use an electric vehicle. Therefore, they're still using gas-powered vehicles. Guilbeault here is saying we can have our cake and eat it too. And it's nonsense. That isn't the case. It's never the case. Gasoline is an inelastic good. Fuel is an inelastic good. We need to keep using it. We have to. We have no other choice. And so this carbon rebate doesn't incentivize Canadians away from oil and gas, or it does so very minimally. Instead, it simply lets us keep using oil and gas to a higher capacity than we would otherwise be allowed to do. It's pure political theater from government.
Alors, nous sommes ici pour parler de la redevance canadienne, seulement aux Québécois et aux Québécoises pour les grands polluants depuis 2019. Les ressources d'eau.
Thank you so very much, Stephen. When we think about who this impacts, I'm here to talk about young people, because for young people in this country, this isn't about if climate change is a thing or whether or not climate change is making an impact. It's the fact that it is. And this is the cohort, this is the group in Canada that has been ringing the bell about climate change for a very long time.
This is such garbage. Government doesn't want you to drive. That's the play. That's the end game. They want you totally dependent on them for everything, for heating, for transportation, for all of it. It is nonsense. This is pure activism. Of course, they invoke the environmental argument because no one knows what climate change means. No one knows what saving the planet means. So it lets the Liberals do whatever they want for as long as they want in the name of normalizing this world in which we live. What does that mean? No one has a clue. If we had the same weather every single day, that would be abnormal because that is not the status quo. Weather's hostile. Weather's harsh. That's just a fact of reality. It's a fact of the fall of man. Here are Adam and Eve cast out of the garden, warned by God that the world is going to resist you. It's going to put up a fight, but you have dominion over it. And so you have the call to bring it under your domain, bring it under your will. And that means, in this case, using oil and gas to do so. It lets us live a far more comfortable life, a better quality of life, a longer life, than what would otherwise be possible. Can you imagine living in this climate without oil and gas?
It's not if, it is now. I want to mention something that Minister Guilbeault mentioned because it's important to have facts and have numbers. And in my Ontario riding, the rebate means $1,124 back. And that is significant. That money can go a long way.
How much money do they pay in carbon tax? Like this is the garbage, is they always talk about this rebate without ever talking about where the rebate money comes from. 90% of the carbon tax goes towards funding that rebate, according to StatsCan. So how is it possible then that Canadians are better off paying a carbon tax and then getting a rebate than they otherwise would be if they just kept the money and didn't have to pay a carbon tax? There wouldn't be a rebate, of course, but there wouldn't be a carbon tax to pay.
Young people and their families, that money can go a long way. Last week, it was one of the warmest days on record in Toronto. So for anybody, if Mr. Poilievre is ever suggesting, and he does, that climate change isn't a thing, you need only point at that. We need only look west, and I'm sure Minister Sajjan will talk about this, to the wildfires. We need to look to the Arctic and all these other places to know that this exists. The last thing that I will say—
These lunatics would go back in history and they'd say, well, there's an ice age. There was an ice age that happened, and so humans have to change. There was no oil, no gas. At least none of that was being pumped. There was no combustion vehicles, no natural gas heaters, none of those things. And yet still the Earth experienced an ice age. The Earth experienced a flood. Didn't come from humans.
Is who pays the bill? If we are to defer action on climate change, if we are to sit pat and say, well, it's just fine, who pays that bill? Young people pay the bill. And we won't let that happen. We are here to act, and we are here to act in the best interests.
Young people are paying the bill right now. Everyone is paying the bill right now. What is she talking about? If we don't act now, young people will pay the bill. Am I exempt from the carbon tax? I'm not. I know, because I just filled up my truck the other day.
Canadians and young Canadians. Thank you so much. ABK? Everybody's so polite. Everybody's so polite.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Van Couverden. I'm proud to be the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, as well as to the Minister of Sport and Physical Activity. And what I was hoping to talk, I'm very proud to be here with my colleagues standing up for climate action today. The cost of doing nothing is simply untenable. We know that climate change is not only real, but we have an obligation as Canadians to stand up against it, to lower our emissions, and to ensure that we're also there for Canadians during this affordability crisis. I also wanted to talk about inflation today because we got the inflation numbers for February back, and inflation is once again down in Canada, which is really good news. And actually, inflation was driven down by lower grocery prices. Now, food's still too expensive. Life's still too expensive in Canada. But
Not going to listen to this garbage. We'll do a separate video on inflation. Inflation is down. It's still rising. Inflation is still positive. And the metrics that they use to calculate inflation are incorrect. Their definition of inflation is incorrect. At any rate, this presser is nonsense. Pure nonsense. We are told that, again, we can pay a carbon tax, but we also get a rebate, and so everyone is better off. And that's false. It's wrong. That's wrong. Oh, well, if you don't use carbon, you'll still get your rebate. You'll still get, you'll save $600 a year or whatever it might be because you're not paying the carbon tax anymore. But the cost imposed of not using carbon is far higher than the benefit that is received because of this rebate. Gasoline is an inelastic good. We need it. We're so thankful that we have it. Oil and gas is an inelastic good. We need it. We're so thankful we have it, especially when it's minus or plus 30 or we have to travel farther than a kilometer. And this government is ruthless.